And now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Okay, good evening, and thank you for joining us for this very special event, an exciting event that I know many of you have been looking forward to, and I have too. Obviously, our main guest is Martin Luther King III, but he is Professor King, as Professor Gaines is going to point out in just a moment, professor of practice at the Center for Politics, which is part of the University of Virginia, but I think it's the best part. That's just my personal opinion. Anyway, let me introduce my co-moderator for the evening, who's going to introduce Professor King. He's already heard my introductions. He's sick of them. He told me, please, let's get somebody else. He didn't say that. You can. It's okay to laugh. It's all right. You can pretend. You can pretend they're funny. Professor Kevin Gaines is, and I love the fact that he holds this chair, Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice at UVA. For those of you who are younger, you may not know that Julian Bond was here for many years and graced these grounds and I think improved so many pieces of the University of Virginia. Unfortunately, he has gone on to the heavenly choir. But we miss him and we remember him. Anyway, Julian Bond, Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice at UVA, joint appointment in the Corcoran Department of History and the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. He's author of the forthcoming book, The African American Journey, A Global History, by the prestigious Oxford University Press. They've rejected many of my manuscripts. Would you talk to them for me, please?
I just believe you, Larry.
Know. Okay. Dr. Gaines's books include Uplifting the Race, Black Leadership, Politics, and Culture During the 20th Century at the University of North Carolina Press, which was awarded the American Studies Association's John Hope Franklin Book Prize, which is very prestigious. He's a past president of the American Studies Association. So that's a short version of a very long and impressive resume, but you can look it up. You know, you Google things, Google. They may be suing it and breaking it up. So Google him tonight, just in case they get to that. Please welcome Professor Kevin Gaines.
Thank you, Larry. It's my honor to introduce our guest speaker. We're delighted to have with us today Professor Martin Luther King III. He is a professor of practice, as Larry just said, with the UVA Center of Politics. So we welcome him here today, not as a guest, but as a colleague. You don't have to be a student of government or law or politics to recognize his name. A civil rights advocate and global humanitarian, Professor King is the oldest son of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King. He is a thought leader on the world stage, a peacemaker, and a negotiator on some of today's most critical national and international platforms for social change. Amplifying the work of his father, Professor King has devoted his life to promoting global human rights and eradicating racism, violence, and poverty, referred to by his father as the triple evils and the scourges of humankind worldwide. Professor King and his wife, who also joins us tonight, Mrs. Andrea Waters King, have led the Drum Major Institute since 2021. The Drum Major Institute was started over 60 years ago with the goal of advancing the core mission and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As board chairman, Mr. King has guided the Drum Major Institute in their mission to democratize the King legacy through education, action, engagement with world leaders, and collaboration with socially conscious organizations. The work of the Drum Major Institute is as important today as it was then, igniting a movement that began more than 6 decades ago to inspire the next generation of activists to make their unique contribution to peace, justice, and equity for all through tangible solutions to our most pressing problems. After successfully relaunching the Drum Major Institute and expanding its reach, Professor and Mrs. King hosted the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, the largest civil rights event of 2023. The march brought thousands to the nation's capital and engaged more than 100 partner organizations. Professor and Mrs. King also recently announced the Realize the Dream initiative, with the ambitious goal of collecting 100 million service hours by Dr. King's 100th birthday, the anniversary of his birth on January 15th, 2029. Through strategic partnerships and relationships with civil rights leaders and prominent activists, Professor and Mrs. King are committed to realizing the dream and empowering the next generation. Please welcome Professor and Mrs. King.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Let me start our conversation this evening with a broad question. We're here on a college campus with many, many young people. I see many young people in the audience, even younger than college age. Could you tell us about the work that you and Mrs. King are doing with the Realize the Dream initiative, and the many other projects that you've engaged with? And how can students and the general public take part and get involved in this work?
Thank you so much for the question, and let me say how honored I am to be back here at the University of Virginia. I have to thank Professor Sabato for who's responsible for my being here. What I really like about the title is that it's called Professor of Practice. So if you enjoy, and you may have heard me if you heard me early today, if you enjoy and agree or disagree, but if you enjoy it, great. If not, understand I'm practicing. So I'm gonna get there. In all seriousness, the work of Realize the Dream was a concept that my wife and I came up with a couple of years back, maybe 3 now. And we were looking at how divided our nation was, not necessarily envisioning that it was going to be even worse, although you have to look at the trends and see the direction that we're headed. And so understanding that Dad's 100th birthday was rapidly approaching, what could we do to bring people together? What could we do to have people turn to each other and stop turning on each other? And so we came up with this project, and as we got close to the election this year, knowing that regardless of what direction the election went in, that we still would need to create a scenario where people could work together on something bigger than themselves. Because when we get consumed and focus on ourselves, that's good to do from a foundational standpoint. But when you're doing something that's bigger than yourself, it really can create opportunities to build bridges. 100 million hours of service is equivalent to about $3 billion if you had to pay individuals for that work. And we are not suggesting to people, well, you need to do this or you need to do that. It really is what speaks to your heart, because we know that all of us will be truly engaged when we're doing something that we want to do, whether it's around mental health, whether it's around mentoring, whether it's around helping seniors, whether it's around tutoring, any number of issues. And so we think that this is part of what my father talked about in building the beloved community. And his last book, in a prophetic way, was titled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? We've all seen chaos for quite a number of years now, and we still have to work toward community. So one of the first things I've done, and I'm going to continue to reinforce this, is I've reached out indirectly to the president-elect, because I heard him say, I listened very carefully, that I want to I want to bring our nation together. Now, the challenge is, what does that mean? But I've said to him indirectly at this point, that means that you have to reach out to almost half the country who did not support you. And if you're not willing to do that, you obviously are not serious in bringing the country together. It doesn't mean that we have to agree on every issue. My dad, my mom, and many others, politically, I remember as a young person when President Ronald Reagan was president back in 1980, and the then Speaker, Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, and he worked together in a very respectful way. And we made progress in this nation. It is now at a level that is just not sustainable. And where we go, we're in a very difficult set of circumstances, I think. Some may not know that yet, but I just remember, I don't like conflict. I'm more conflict adverse. And that's why I married, wait a minute, let me say this carefully.
Watch it.
One of the reasons that my lovely wife is the president of the Drum Major Institute. See, as the chair, you can kind of address things at one level, but she's in charge. And she can say no. You ask me, I'm like, well, maybe, but maybe's not really true. Sometimes you just need to say no. And it takes all kind to create this beloved community that I'm talking about. And so our hope is this initiative will move our nation forward, not just in 2029 as we get to the final year before his birth in January of 2029, but as we're building the infrastructure and the network and sharing this message of that is uplifting. Some of us, well, I know that's one of the questions, so I'll just stop now. Get to the question.
You said no to yourself. That's great. Okay. Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say, preface it with your suggestion about, for example, focusing on mental health. Based on the messages that I've gotten since last Tuesday, you could rack up a lot of time and effort and grace working on mental health, because there are a lot of very unhappy, upset people. I think it's wonderful that you're doing what you can do. Maybe he'll actually, Trump I'm talking about, maybe he'll actually listen when it comes from you. I'll be shocked, but in my life I've been shocked many times, including last Tuesday. And I'll leave it at that. But that's not what I'm going to ask you. I couldn't help it. When you said that, I had to talk about it. Your dad spoke here, as you know, because we've talked about it, and you've given a speech down there too. March 25th of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. gave an address in Cabell Hall, Old Cabell Hall, directly at the end of the lawn. Absolutely packed. The Old Cabell Hall auditorium then, and I think even now, is the largest forum available. You can stuff a lot of people in there, and it was absolutely packed, no standing room, et cetera. What really impressed me, and I think you were only maybe 6 or 7 at the time, but what was so impressive about it was that he had received an invitation from Black students at the University of Virginia. I think there were 4. Really, it was just embarrassing. And the community, Charlottesville community, to come and talk about the future of the Civil Rights Revolution. Where were we going? And people were mesmerized by what he had to say. Now, who do I mean by people? I mean a lot of people from the community and a lot of white students in coats and ties, because that's what they wore back then. It was all male, and they wore coats and ties. So it looked like a distinguished group, even though I doubt it at the time. But but I tell you what wasn't there. There wasn't one single representative of a senior level at the University of Virginia. No administrator, no member of the Board of Visitors, because the board had sent out word that no one was to attend because they called your father, this is a private meeting, they called your father a troublemaker. We've heard that one a lot. And so it's so, I think it's so important and moving that you are here with us and that you are a professor of practice, and you're doing much better than practicing, much better than practicing. You're right there, here with us, and it's something that we will always remember and appreciate. Now, that wasn't a question, and I'm not sure what it was you wanted me to ask, but maybe if your father was here and he drove himself. That was the incredible thing. He didn't have any bodyguards. He had no aides. He drove himself from Georgia here. I mean, in those days, that was dangerous. So what do you, if your father were here now, he'd be very proud of you, obviously, and your whole family, but can you think of what he might say that we need to devote our attention to, other than your initiative, of course?
All of this obviously is speculative, and none of us could say what he would do, but what I will say is had Robert Kennedy lived, our nation would be on a totally different trajectory. I think we would, by and large, be past the hatred that still exists in this country. There would be some individuals, because unfortunately, hate is a commodity that is promoted and programmed and recreated. Not one child is born hating. They may be born a little aggressive or assertive, but they don't dislike. They don't harbor negativity necessarily. All of that is reinforced and programmed and promoted. So, but I think we would be past some of that had Dad lived. If he appeared today, I don't know what he would be thinking, totally perplexed. He and his team and others worked to get a Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. They worked to get a Voting Rights Act passed in 65. They worked to get fair housing legislation in 1968. And as opposed to us appearing to make progress, it feels as if we've taken some steps backward. And I think the election showed us that in a real way. Does not mean that people don't have legitimate concerns around the economy, around so many issues. But we have not yet come to a conclusion of how we open our minds. We've chosen to close our minds. And we are afraid of progress. We're afraid, in an honest way, of the fact that European Americans will no longer be the majority of the population. We need to have a real conversation. We have for years run around the issues of race as if race is not an issue. Now, I'm not saying that from a victim standpoint, because if you always appear as a victim, you will never overcome whatever those challenges are. We see people every day who overcome a situation because they have a mindset that is beyond, yes, I am ostracized, I am mistreated, but I'm not going to live in that frame. I'm going to live in what I can create or what I can become. And no one is going to stop me from becoming what I want to become. And so that climate has to be nurtured and fostered. You didn't ask me this, but I think we have to reckon with the fact that we live in a nation in 2024. In this era, this United States ought to be embarrassed that we have not had a female head of state, in my judgment, just me personally. I mean, Mexico just elected a female president. The UK has had female prime ministers. Germany has had a female head of state. Liberia on the African continent has had a female head of state. Jamaica, just to name a few of the countries around the world, the Philippines. So the United States, which purports to be so much further ahead of others, we are in terms of the $23 trillion economy that only services some of our population. And that may be part of the real problem. Some people here in this audience are going to be, and may already be, amazing entrepreneurs, creators of opportunities for others. Some are working to become legal scholars. Some are maybe historians and professors, and just about everything that exists within our society. And yet, I think my dad used to say something like, we can swim the air. We can swim the waters as fish. We can fly in the air as birds, but we don't yet know how to conquer the major concept of human beings treating other human beings with dignity and justice and righteousness. That's kind of interesting. Our technology is so far advanced, but we don't know how to treat our neighbor. We walk past each other every day and don't speak to one another. And part of it is we're consumed now with our smartphones, our devices. But even before we had these devices, we still would only selectively speak to some. And you never know, because everything really is energy, but you never know how just saying, hello, how are you? What that does to another person who may be in a very depressed state of mind. And you may change their station just because you chose to identify them and connect with them. So we're sort of disconnected in a real sense. We're probably more disconnected than we've ever been. And Andrea and I and our partners with Realizing the Dream have a book coming out called What is Your Legacy? Your current living legacy and the legacy of what may become in the future. And so hopefully, I'm giving you a little bit of information so that you can look for it coming out in January of next year. I was going to make a point, but I'm going to inject a little humor. Although I shouldn't say this, because what you say is what you become. So some people may have Alzheimer's. Maybe I have part-timers, but I'm gonna reject that because I really don't believe that, but I did lose my thought.
It's probably because you're sitting next to me.
I doubt that.
I do it all day, all the time.
Well, I want to ask what I know is a sensitive question, but I understand that you're open to talking about it. You were 10 years old, going on 11, when your father was assassinated. Could you talk about memories of your father? Mm-hmm. And also, since this question has to do with your memories of your father and your family life, whatever you would like to tell us that you would like us to know about your mother as well, Coretta Scott King. I'd love to hear your view on that. It had to have been difficult with your father and your mother having the demands of the movement, and it must have had an impact on your family, your time with them. But if you could talk about your parents and your recollections of them.
Thank you for that question, and I'll start with how they met, because both of them were in Boston. Dad was at Boston University working on his PhD degree, and Mom was at the Boston Conservatory of Music. They were set up on a blind date, and they spent 6 hours together on their very first date. And when Dad arrived, Mom was already there, and she was sort of not necessarily looking forward to being in dialogue with a minister, not because she was against ministers, but she had grown up in the AME Zion Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Marion, Alabama, a small community. And all of the ministers that she knew, for whatever reason, didn't have a lot of depth, is how she would describe it. But she had not met Martin Luther King. So when she met him, she looked, and he was dressed very nicely. He had a hat on, a stylish hat, a coat in Boston. They both had on coats, I'm sure. But the first thing that came in her mind was, he's such a little man. His dad was about 5'6", maybe 5'7" on a good day. He really was not tall at all. And you know, you're programmed to want to say, oh, I'm a tall, debonair, handsome man. Well, he fit some of that, but he just was a little man. They talked for 6 hours. They had read a lot of the same books. Mom had been involved in the peace movement, in fact. And so Dad will say that my wife brought me before I led any demonstration. It was my wife who was already in an advanced manner. And so she said the longer they talked, the taller he grew. Now, I say that to say that the most traumatic incident in my life was when my father was killed on April 4th of 1968. And being a child in our home. And at about 7:01 or 2, the Eastern Standard Time, at 6 o'clock in Memphis, Dad was shot, and it was broadcast over, it might have been CBS. I don't remember which network we were watching. And so once we heard, if you can think about when you hear something like that, your whole body tightens up. And so the four of us were watching television in our den area, and we ran back to Mom and Dad's room. And Mom was preparing to go to Memphis because she had received a call from Ambassador Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson. And as she was preparing, she didn't know other than that it was going to be a challenge. So when she arrived at the airport in Atlanta, a man was walking toward her, and she stopped in the restroom before boarding her plane. And when she came out, the man was walking toward her in a way that she knew. She first didn't know who it was, and then she saw in the distance, oh, that's the mayor. So the mayor of Atlanta at that time, a man by the name of Ivan Allen, came over and he said, Mrs. King, Dr. King did not make it. So she chose to come back home and talk to the four of us. And my younger sister was asleep. She was 5 years old. My older sister Yolanda was 12, I was 10, and my younger brother Dexter was 7. And she said in substance, your father is gone home to live with God. She said that when he sees you, he will not be able to hug and kiss you as he would do often, as much as he could. It will look as if he is resting and he's at peace, but one day we'll see him again. Now, I'm sure there was far more conversation than that, but that was the essence of the foundation. We had, I'm sure, a zillion questions, my siblings and I. And so advance, I believe, next day was Friday, maybe Saturday. The Kennedy family chartered a plane to bring Dad's remains back to Atlanta. And so we did not go that day, but Dad's remains arrived, and then there were 2 or 3 days, maybe a couple of days, and then on Monday, which would have been just a few days after his assassination, we went to Memphis, where Dad was to lead a demonstration. My mom took the 3 older ones of us, and no one had been captured for the murder. So it was obviously very difficult. Then the next day, when we arrived back in Atlanta on that Monday, Tuesday was his funeral, and he was eulogized. In fact, he, in a sense, eulogized himself. The last words that were played were from a speech that actually our name is sort of derived from, which is the drum major instinct. And in those remarks, he does his own eulogy. And those were that little portion of the sermon were the last words that people heard after the physical eulogies were done by Dr. Ralph Abernathy at Ebenezer and at Morehouse College. One of Dad's mentors and a great, great president of Morehouse, Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. So, but the last words the audience has heard were his own eulogy, that he wanted to be remembered not for the awards and accolades. He wanted to be remembered for serving, being a servant. He wanted to be remembered for trying to feed those who did not have food, to clothe those who did have not clothing. And so that was Mother's vision and intent. Now, I say that to say she was a true partner of Dad, and certainly in the sense that oftentimes the very difficult decisions, the last person he would talk to before he made a decision was he would always run it by my that's why I do that a lot, honey. Run it by Mom. So, but he wanted to ensure that he was on the right path. And like everyone, he made a lot of mistakes, like all of us. But understanding who she was and what she meant and what she would do. And many of us, most of us should, but not always. We really love our moms. My mother started the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change in June. Dad was killed in April, and ultimately built what she defined was a living memorial to collect his archives, to teach people nonviolence. And in a real sense, in our own ways, and certainly in Andrea and the way that we are working, along with our daughter Yolanda, to really help to continue to build a beloved community. I'm going to be through in a minute. But I come out of a family of Baptist preachers. And, from my great-great-grandfather to my grandfather, to my father, to my father's brother, the list goes on. And so we could be here for a while, but bear with me, I'm almost done. But when I was a kid, we would take Dad to the airport, maybe once or twice a week. Mom would drive, and some of us, not all of us, because there were 4 of us, and we had a station wagon at one time, but I remember another car, and I'm like, that car was too small for all of us to ride, I think. But we would pass by an amusement park in Atlanta. It was named Funtown, and it was like a Six Flags or a Great American theme park. And in the early 60s, maybe 62 or so, when we passed by, we'd say, Daddy, when we want to go to Funtown. And Dad would say, well, we can't go today, but my team and I are working, so those doors will be open to us permanently. And I mean, you would see kids on the Ferris wheel, on the bumper cars, eating cotton candy and, popcorn, just having amazing fun, all white kids. The day those barriers were dropped, it was like heaven. It was like, oh my God, this is so fun. And Dad was like a big kid anyway. I mean, he just enjoyed getting on those rides with his children, and we enjoyed it equally. So after you go one time or twice or 3 times, you forget that you weren't able to go at one time. So you move on to something else. Intellectually, it's still in the head, but you're like, this is just amazing. I used to go to the YMCA with my father and my brother and I, and he'd get exercise, taught us how to swim. We traveled with him 8 or 9 times. I remember most of the stops that where he'd go to a church, a rally at a church or a community center or any building, and before he left, he touched everyone who came out. When we'd go to restaurants to eat, he would go back into the kitchen and shake everyone's hand and thank them. Kindness was what he personified. All of that I remember. But I also remember during that April 4th period, I didn't consciously focus on this, and it certainly is not what Dad would have wanted to see. But at that time, over 100 cities went up in flames at the time of his death. That's not what he advocated, would have wanted to see. But he used to say violence is the language of the unheard. When people are not heard and not seen, they resort to extreme measures, which It's very unfortunate. And so he worked, and my mom worked throughout her life. And Andrea and I are working now to create a nation that is one that operates in nonviolence, teaching people how to live together without destroying person or property. I think that's needed now because at our political space, the divisions are so significant. And because people have engaged in fear and not faith. And when I say faith, I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about the spirit as a faith that we have lost. And so when you embrace your fears, you do things that don't seem rational and are irresponsible and can be destructive. But when you stay based in faith, Dad was a Christian minister, but he also understood that in all faiths there's connections. And so he understood how to interact with those who had different religious traditions, as well as those who might be agnostic or atheists. You know, he spoke to everyone. He didn't ostracize, well, you're not like me, so I'm not saying that's what any of us do, but you're not like me, so I don't want to be around you. That's not who he was. He wanted to engage with everyone. And then he also focused on whatever is good in each of us. If you're 90% bad, hypothetically, he focused like a laser on the 10% that's good. And he worked to extract that out, to create community. We need more of that in my judgment today. So
That was fascinating.
That was
Go on
wonderful.
as long as you want for any of these questions. I learned a lot from that. It really
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, we have enough questions to get through the time, and we don't need them all. But it was so wonderful to hear you talking about your father and your mother and those memories. And I think a full biography of your mother, Coretta Scott King, is long overdue. I imagine someone's working on one now, but I think that's going to be a major contribution. Larry, why don't you go with the next?
Yes. Well, great. You got a lighter topic for me. Last week's election. Thanks a lot. That was the answer you just gave was so fascinating. I hate to bring everybody down with this discussion, but let me just ask generally, what did you think about it? As you sat there and watched the returns, and I know you, like many of us, were disappointed with the results, but as you watched the returns, what were you thinking?
just that. I was greatly disappointed in this nation that I love deeply. And much of it was reminiscing what we were going to have to endure for the next 4 years. There's a such thing as a constructive disruptor, which I consider my dad was. And there's a such thing as a destructive disruptor. And for me, the former president, for whatever reason, chose to embrace the disrupting, which people get confused, but destructive disruption. It's not sustainable. And a lot of people are going to suffer over the next 4 years, even though you may think that things are going to be great. And they may be factually for some individuals, and that's fine. But we got to get to a higher level. We're operating at the lowest level. There's a higher level energetically that we need to get to, because there's a such thing as human beings in humanity to human beings. And that's what we're practicing now. We do not treat each other with dignity and respect. Dad and Mom taught us how to disagree without being disagreeable. And I think, as I said earlier, I know I've said it today many times, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill and many others after them showed us that, look, we can navigate. We don't have to totally agree on everything. We're not a monolithic society, nor are we monolithic people. You have the right to choose. And I want to impart energy that is positive on our planet. That's what I choose to do. I don't have to, certainly if I didn't want to. But I believe that that's the way for me. And that's part of how we partially want to make our contribution. And I think that the election, it showed us that we aren't anywhere near where we need to be. I think I said here, I know I said it earlier, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I don't think anything changes. I'm disappointed that my nation rejected, again, a woman. I sort of understand it, but I'm very disappointed. I'm disappointed that my nation chose to lift up a person who has been convicted of felonies, a person who's been accused and convicted of rape, just to name some things, and that you turn a blind eye to that which you see. And we're better than that. He is who he's always been. So the question is, what does that mean when this is who we choose for leadership? Every leader has had some issues because none of us are perfect, nor will we ever be. But to lift up a nation that has so many problems, we maybe should have considered some of the things that we didn't. And I won't get into the specifics of what each campaign did, but I will say there should have been a clear contrast. And I always felt the majority of America was different, but it affirmed to me that there is a lot of work that has to be done. Right here in this city, when he said that there were good people on both sides, maybe there was an intent to be good, but I'm not really sure what that, I don't know how you interpret that. Because what I do know is all of the people who really have deep-seated hate and hostility, they supported him and continue to lift that up. And again, that will not sustain us. We will implode internally as opposed to building community externally and building a better nation and planet. I believe most parents want their children to do better than them. Most parents want to see a world where you can have plenty. And it's crazy that we live in a $23 trillion economy, and yet we have the audacity to have poor people. Now, the solution is not giving people money. That may be a part of a solution, probably a small part of the solution. But the biggest issue is, how do you create the opportunity for people to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps? Which means, yes, you give a man a fish, he's fed for a day. You teach him to fish and he's able to feed himself and his family for a lifetime. We need to create a system that teaches people how to fish so that they can maximize the opportunities for themselves and then focus on building community. So I'm disappointed, but I'm sure that in history there have been many times when history has gone in a direction, and there's some serious examples of how people overcame in light of their circumstances. Certainly enslaved people had to overcome. If you think about it, a lot of the history today, we don't want to teach it. We don't want our children to know how terrible we've been. And it is said that a people that do not remember their history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. We need to ensure, we shouldn't be banning books. We should certainly not have children reading certain material. But we have book bans all across this country, whether it's books on the Holocaust, whether it's books on the modern civil rights movement, whether it's books on, think about the fact, and we know of Oklahoma, and we know, when it was burned down. We know of Rosewood. But do you know that there are like 50 communities that were burned to the ground in this country? And that wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was for a kid, many kids, you say 100 years, that's a long time. No, it's not. I mean, it's not that long. And if those communities had been left to their own existence, then the entire African American community would be dramatically different. Although last year we spent $1.2 trillion, $1.3 trillion. Well, if those communities had been left to their own development, maybe our economy would be $28 trillion instead of 23. But people intentionally rejected banks and insurance companies and motels and other businesses, burned it to the ground. Now, I'm not saying that as a victim. Well, I'm a victim. I'm saying it because people need to know that, to know we should never, ever do a human being like that. That should never happen. Just as the Holocaust should never, ever happen again. We are God's, those of us who believe in God, God's highest creation. We need to act like it. Dad used to say something like, God's highest creation has an ability. And you've never seen a group of pigs talking about Plato and Shakespeare, Euripides. They don't have that capacity. You've never seen a group of pigeons talking about, I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, I'm atheist. They don't have that ability. You've never seen a group of dogs talking about, I'm Democrat, I'm Republican, I'm independent. We as God's highest creation represent that and have the capacity to think and reason. And yet when it comes to frustration and confusion, we operate to the lower animal means, survival of the fittest, as animals do, lower animals do. We got to do better, or we will cease to be here. And it really only takes a few good human beings to bring about goodness and justice and righteousness. But we have to work on that each and every day.
Magnificent.
Yeah. I would like for us to have some time to ask questions. This is your opportunity to ask questions to Martin Luther King III. I do have one more question. Since the election, I've been talking to my students, and many are discouraged by the result and by the sheer ugliness of the campaign, with the attacks, racism and sexism, misogyny. What would you tell young people, maybe the first-time voters, who are discouraged by the result? And what would you tell them to just hopefully persevere and prepare for the next election so that their voices can be heard then?
So I think I would say, first of all, we have to decide if we choose to be change agents. And if you choose to be, you can't just sit aside and say, well, there's nothing I can do. All of us can do a little something. That's why, again, we came up with Realize the Dream. Because certainly, when we talk about a collective can be massive. And certainly we need a collective of consciousness. We need more consciousness. It doesn't, again, mean we're going to agree on everything, nor should we. But we certainly can agree to disagree. And we can create the climate for forward movement, not backward movement. Our daughter, 16 years old, she's an activist. Because of where we are, she has fewer rights. She was born in 2008, at the time President Obama was running. She has lost rights. She has fewer rights than her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother. And really, since, the Black codes became a part of history. And what I mean by that is, after, the revolution, many years ago, and you in Virginia probably know this better than anybody, but, there were Black U.S. senators. There were Black governors, not many, but some. There were Blacks in elected office. Then the Black codes were put in place to turn the laws back. And all of a sudden, there were no more Black elected officials at that time. You know that in recent years, your state is the first state to have elected a black governor. Tragically, we hadn't had too many more, I think two. Of course, in Maryland now we have Wes Moore. But, I remember when Governor Wilder was elected and what he was able to do to build a coalition to actually be the chief executive of this state. But when you look at, even in Congress today, women represent the majority in terms of numbers of the population. But there's still a long way before parity exists in Congress with women. There are a number of women elected. A lot more need to be elected. And that covers a lot of things. So all I'm saying, and if you want to see change, you have to choose to be a part of the change that you want to create. And you can never let these obstacles stop you, no matter how difficult it gets to be. I didn't necessarily think we'd be in a climate where people could make threats against people because they disagree with who they are and what they represent. And they are so angry and hostile that they're willing to do harm to someone. That climate has been propagated and promoted. And that's not who we say we are. I mean, we help. There's all kind of things we do all over the world for those who are our allies and even sometimes those who may not be. And that is the kind of thing that makes us a good and decent country. But now we're moving in a direction where we're doing things that may be counterproductive and disruptive and destructive. And, those it's not going to happen by osmosis. We have to work to save ourselves. That means we all need to be engaged to see what kind of nation and world we want to create for our children and our children's children and children yet unborn. So that's the longer version. Some would say keep hope alive, whatever that means. But that is certainly part of the equation too. We cannot lose faith. And I say, don't give up, don't give out, don't give in. We must keep, and I'm talking about from a positive standpoint. Keep depositing positive energy into the universe. And the universe, my father has a sermon entitled, "Is the Universe Friendly?" I would encourage you to listen to that sermon. Is the universe friendly? And then he has one entitled, "What is your life's blueprint?" That's a very important one for students. What is your life's blueprint? Just for consideration.
Do we have time for questions? Okay, well, a hand just went up
got
in the front.
Got a mic coming up.
Okay, very good.
So everybody
And there's a
can hear you.
microphone making the rounds.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for being here and for this talk. Thank you for the people that put this on. This was wonderful. And so glad to be here. I have so many questions and I'm not quite sure where to start, but I guess I have a question about like creating a beloved community that you mentioned. And you also mentioned like emotions like rage and anger and love. And I guess I'm curious in this moment, like what are the practices that you have to stay grounded? How do you stay grounded? What are like the technologies, practices? Because I think about in this moment, it sounds important to have conversations across difference, but like there's anger. And it's like, I think it's real and valid, but it also makes it challenging to, for example, talk to someone who shouldn't think that someone like me should be in a position of power. So in a very like, I don't know, this might be too personal, like in an honest, it's just like, how do you even get to a place where you can have a conversation without things like defensiveness and anger to be able to communicate across difference? And if that is like the main way, like what are other ways of like cultivating this beloved community? Thank you.
Very good question. I'll start by saying one first has to create a process for themselves for edification and operating from a strong foundation. Now, I mean, you could probably accomplish much of it just by shutting off the TV, disconnecting from social media. That's where you start. Not permanently, but you really have to take a vacation from television because it's a dangerous tool. And when you understand that all media, they're not in business just to present what is the news, they're in business to make money, and it's about ratings. And so they'll do things for that purpose as opposed to when I was growing up, the news was just presented. They didn't tell me what I knew I wasn't seeing, but what they said it was. I mean, today you were told things, that's not what I saw, but you're told it over and over. And whether it's on a Fox News or whether it's on an MSNBC, they all have messaging. It's always funny to me to ask people who tell me that Fox is fair and balanced. I said, well, why do you think that? And of course, they tell you that all day long. We're fair and balanced. Even though that probably, if you analyze it deeply, is not the case. It has a targeted audience, a large audience, by the way. And they have been promoting and propagating things. But again, you have to intellectually understand that's a business. That's not necessarily for your interest or not for your interest. It's only for their interest, which is we're going to get ratings because we say something sometimes that are outlandish. And I'm not picking on Fox. This is what all media does. Maybe not PBS. They do present the news, and that I wish we could get back. You can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste canister. But what you can do is make a decision yourself. Oftentimes, we have a ritual. My wife is the creator of that. And what I mean by that is, I thank God every day for her because, we love music, all kinds of music, but we listen to a regimented kind of music because you'll find through technology that certain music causes certain reactions. And one day we need to have a conversation about what is being deposited. We as a community, as a nation, a world, we love certain cultural trends. But if you're listening to garbage, you're going to become garbage. Now, that doesn't mean you can't listen to it occasionally. But the problem is we consume too much of the garbage, the negative things. I mean, we allow music that denigrates people to be promoted, and we buy it by mass. That's gangster rap. First of all, in the name, gangster. And this is who our young people are wanting to embrace. Yeah, I want to be like so-and-so. Some of those who voted for the president saw him as a gangster. And he went, so that's why I'm going to embrace him, because he gangster. Well, somebody didn't teach them that being a gangster is not a good thing. So somehow you've made that good. And so education is the key. Consciousness is the key. Purification and edification. And, it's almost like we got to cleanse. And, we all have some bad habits. Mine may be eating a little bit too much. And I got to work on that. I've been working on that for a while. But I hadn't succeeded. But I'm going to succeed. But the real simple concept is what you ingest creates who you become. So we have to be very careful about what we ingest. I have a friend who's here who has a coffee company. And the name of that company is Purity. And his intention and his family's intention, because his wife is involved, his daughter's involved, is to create the best coffee, but the most highly protected coffee on the planet. And he's doing that every day because he wakes up every day focused on what can we do to make this coffee even better? And it happens to be good. Now, good has to be one of the factors that exist. I'm not a coffee, I don't drink anybody's coffee but his. So think about Purity Coffee. I'm doing a commercial, Andrew. Purity Coffee. Now, that's the intent. Contribution should be important to all of us in our lives. Not just a contribution to ourselves. You got to master that first. Dad used to say that of the preservation is stronger than self-preservation, more important than self-preservation, because in helping others, you end up helping yourself as well. And I think that's critically important. So, you know, I hope I provide that example. I hope we provide that example. We show up every day. I talked about my mom, my grandmother, excuse me, and my father, and how I think I talked about that here.
You mentioned it, but I don't think.
Oh, okay. Let me tell this because I've shared it today 2 or 3 times, so I wasn't sure if I shared it at this audience. You know, I was 10 years old when my father was killed. You may or may not know that also my grandmother was killed.
Right.
I had to make a choice of whether or not I was going to show up with hurt, like a broken person, or a person who wants to heal and advocate, you know, with love and justice. I could have easily misliked or disliked everybody because my dad was killed by a white man. My grandmother was killed by a black man. So I could have hated all y'all. But I made a choice to embrace love and forgiveness. I say that because my grandfather used to say after my grandmother was killed, I refuse to allow any man to reduce me to hatred. The man that killed my lovely wife, nor the man that killed my son. I refused to hate them. I love everybody. I'm every man's brother. So I had to make a choice to show up in the world in that way every day. So I share this with kids when I go to schools on a frequent basis with little kids, because there's going to be challenges that all of us have to face. It's not the challenge, it's what you choose to do to overcome the challenge. If I hit you, I'm not going to hit you, but if I did, and you fall down, which you will, and I come back 3 days later, you're still on the ground, that's on you. Now, I did hit you, so I did wrong, but it's up to you to rise above the circumstance. And in our society, we almost have to do that. We have been knocked down, some of us, almost half the country, with this particular election. We can't just stay waddling, oh God, it's awful, it's gonna be awful. No, we gotta think about what do we do to build community? Because our objective is to build community and to build the best community that we can in our nation and world. So you don't give up. You might get tired, you might have to take a break. But fortify, you gotta fortify. Whatever it is that lifts you up, you gotta ingest that, induce that, immerse yourself in that. You know, I mean, I don't know how many days we wake up and my wife is not feeling, not physically, but I mean mentally, we're just in a space. And she puts on some kind of music or some kind of meditation, and all of a sudden, our whole energy changes, because we're ready to go out and fight another day. So,
Excellent.
Well, okay, more hands are going up, and I think we're really short on time, so I think it's only going to have to be one more question, and I guess the person who's closest to the...
Let me ask, maybe if we can let everyone ask those 3 ask questions, and I'll try to create a comprehensive answer. I'll put a word as try. I'll try.
Yes.
That's good.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I think a lot of us really appreciate you and this wonderful conversation. I think many of us probably have the thought on yourself. You know, you stand on the shoulder of giants, your father, your mother, even your grandparents. You've gone through a lot. And I'm very curious as to yourself, how do you kind of forge your own path through all of this? Because, you know, you have to step out of, you know, either the beacon or the shadow that is that of the giants in your family. And we know what defines Professor King yourself. And I'm very curious, how is it that you went through that psychological process in defining yourself and your own path? Thank you.
Good question, by the way. It was 2 more, I think, at least 1 more.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much. Building on the last question, I, like you, have had the opportunity and responsibility to devote most of my career to my father and his legacy and the incredible things that he's done. And my question to you is, was that hard? And how did you balance and forge your own path as you stand on the shoulders of giants?
Yeah. Was there a 3rd one? I thought I saw 3 hands. Okay. 3rd and final question.
All right, I'll try to make it quick. Hi, my name is Danielle. I'm a first-year medical student here at UVA. And my question to you is, what advice do you have for navigating the desire to make change within a system that was not necessarily built for African Americans, especially when it can feel like our values are being compromised for having to participate in it in order to make that change?
Wait a minute.
Was that too convoluted?
I'm gonna do something in a minute. Okay, let me try to figure out how to answer these, and then I'm gonna ask for some help. So I was very fortunate to have a mom that instilled in me values. As a young kid, the value to understand being your best self. She told me, you don't have to go to Morehouse College, where I did. You don't have to be a civil and human rights leader, where I have done that. You don't have to be a minister. Well, I didn't do that. Hadn't been called. I've been waiting by the phone, but that hadn't happened yet. But I do have a ministry, because ministry is to teach. Ministry is what you do every day to create the world that you would love to see. So that is our ministry. This work is our ministry. But the freedom was for Mom to say, be your best self as Martin III. Because if you attempt to wake up every day and follow in your father's footsteps, you will fail miserably. Because you are you, and you have special and unique qualities, and you must continue to build those qualities, and that's what I've been able to do. What I know is the work is not done. So I chose to go into the area of working to create this community where poverty, racism, and violence would at least be minimized. We may not ever have it cease to exist, but we can minimize it dramatically. And certainly in this country where there's so much opportunity. So I don't look at it as trying to be, I don't wake up every morning trying to be Martin Luther King Jr. I'm Martin Luther King III, and I'm gonna be the best that I can be and do the best that I can to help transform society. Now, on the more complicated question, another thing is that this is what I chose is who I am. I would love to say that I would be doing this work regardless of if I happen to be born and have examples like Martin and Coretta King, but I'm not sure that would have been the case. I don't know that. I would love to say, oh no, it did not matter who my parents were. My parents made an indelible contribution to our nation and world, but also to my own personal upbringing. I was an elected official for 7 years in Georgia because I felt I wanted to give something back to the community that nourished my growth and development. And I ran 2 times, won, and then the 3rd time I ran for a different office and lost. And that was a profoundly difficult moment, partially because we are all concerned about how most of us are concerned about how others see us. And no one wants to be seen as a loser. And certainly when you carry such a profound name, but maybe it said to me that, well, politics is not where you should live. Or if I did choose to live there, I should have run for office again right away, and I didn't. So I didn't assume that was the only way I could make a contribution. I've run a number of nonprofit organizations, and that's where I've lived for most of my life, whether it is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference my father co-founded. I led that organization. Whether it's the Martin Luther King Center, I led that organization. Whether it is an organization that was called Realizing the Dream, whether it is now, I don't run it. The Drum Major Institute is run by my wife, Andrea, but we support each other and in building this concept. And so that's intentional. And I guess for any of us, we intentionally must develop our own strategic plan. Everything, there has to be a plan. It doesn't mean we'll always fulfill the total objective of the plan, but you got to have a plan. You can't just, every now and then something to happen, just whatever. But generally, you need a plan. And you need to have prepared yourself for what that plan, being able to execute that plan. Final question. I'm going to ask, I want you to at least have, if this is all right, to have my wife say something as we prepare to close. And oftentimes, she says things that need to be said in a different way, in a more profound way. And because you remember the question? Okay, honey. Andrea Waters King.
First of all, to this young lady and the young lady that asked the question, the morning after the election, the hardest call that we had to make was to our 16-year-old daughter. And so to both of you, to every girl here that looks like you, that looks like me, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this nation still is not ready to see your true brilliance and your power. But you can't let that stop you. I worked many years for an organization that monitored the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi skinheads. I worked for Reverend C.T. Vivian and Ann Braden, and I would implore you to look them up when you get home this evening. Because my belief in humanity is not, and in change and progress, is not based on marrying this magnificent man.
True.
It's working, having been mentored by people who changed the course of this nation. Reverend C.T. Vivian was a lieutenant of Martin's father. And there's famous footage of him standing on the steps of Selma, registering Black people to vote, and being hit by a sheriff and his nose being broken and getting right up and talking about democracy and being willing to die and bleed for democracy. And Ann Braden, who was mentioned in a letter from a Birmingham jail, is a white Southern woman that was in the movement for peace and justice and equity for all of us. There was one thing that I had on my wall when I monitored the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis and skinheads, and it was a quote by Bell Hooks. And it says that we must never become like that which we're fighting against. And so, yes, you're tired. Yes, you're angry. But this has always been a movement of faith. It's a movement that Martin's mother talked about, that freedom is never really won. It's up to each generation to continue to feed the flames of peace and justice and equity. How do we separate from that anger? Martin's father talked about that you separate the evil act from the individual. How do we keep going and continue to tear down systems when people may not really truly understand your power and your light? I think back to Gandhi, when he talked about the fact that, at the darkest times, and when he despairs, because each of us despair. One of the things that we also do in our home is that we listen when we're really down, is we listen to Dr. King's sermons. Martin gave you, Professor King, gave you two great ones today. Edify yourself. Putting on peace, justice, and equity, you have to do that every single day before you leave the house. So feed your soul. Listen to those sermons. Listen to those that came before you. And I think about Gandhi, who said that in the darkest, when he despairs, that he thinks about the fact that tyranny has never really won. He said, it looks like at times that if it would win, it looks like it was winning. He said, but it never won. And then he underscored it by think about it. There's a quote. So go home, read that quote. Don't ever let your light be diminished. continue to feed the flames of peace, of justice and equity. Remember all of those that came before and sacrificed when when it looked impossible. When they were enslaved and they as dark as this night, and they had to just go by the moon for freedom. For when dogs were being sicked on children, and then they went to jail and they still were singing songs of freedom. Those fires are still in us. And now it's our turn to continue that work in the long walk toward freedom. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Wow. Good job. That was good. You're a lucky man. Fantastic.
May I share one final thing?
What's that?
May I share one final thing?
Sure.
You know, I went to visit one of my father's lieutenants. For those of you who may know some history of the modern civil rights movement, there was one of his lieutenants was a man by the name of Hosea Williams. And Hosea was what you'd call an agitator in a positive way. You know, in the old washing machines, I don't know if the ones now have it, there's a device that used to turn back and forth. And it's the thing that helps to get the clothes. It's the agitator that agitated so the clothes would become clean. And Hosea did that literally in relationship to the civil rights movement. He'd go into community and create positive disruption. But he said something one day, and I went to visit him on an issue, and he had a picture of my dad up above his desk, behind him. And he pointed up to Dad, and tears started coming down his eyes. Now, Hosea was a conflicted person in a lot of ways. Anybody from Atlanta would know. He's deceased now, but he has an institution called Hosea Feed the Hungry. So his institution feeds thousands of people every year, probably over 100,000 people. But Hosea said, you know, I loved this man. He taught me a lot of things, but he identified two. He said, he taught me no, he taught me love, but he taught me, and that's funny. You know, he taught me how to conquer the love of wealth and the fear of death. Oh. And I said, wow, that's profound. How to conquer. See, most of us are preoccupied, particularly now when we have multi-billionaires. We all want to be that. And that's okay for us to want to be, and some of us will become that. But when wealth is not important and you're not afraid to die, you're virtually unstoppable in your quest. And Dad represented that you know, I'm not so concerned about just wealth. I know we need money to do things. And I'm not afraid to die for what I believe in. Many people have been willing, and I'm not advocating that you should do this, but if you so feel called, you know, one of the things C.T. Vivian said when the police, Sheriff Jim Clark beat him down, he said, we're here to register. And you may not like what I'm saying, but we're willing to die for what our rights are. Now, sometimes it unfortunately has to be that extreme. You have to at least be willing. And Dad, you know, it feels to me that Dad, if you listen to his last speech, the mountaintop speech, he talked about he had been to the mountain and he looked over and seen the promised land. He said, I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. And so that was a positive note. And it felt like he knew that his time among us was limited, being on the earth. There are a number of other things that happened I won't go into tonight, but I'll tell that the next time. But he knew that his time was shortened and, that it was time for him to move to a different level. And so all I want to compel as we prepare to close is that this nation, this planet, this world we live in, it's for all of us. We have to see things as this is for us, not against us. Yes, there may be people who may be against us, but the world is for us. And the minute you change that projection, as soon as you understand, there really is nothing that is good and just that you cannot do if that's what your intention is. And so, as I say, every day, Andre just shared some of the things. There's a huge ritual. That's just what we presented is just a small part of what, I've chosen to follow her doing. I'm joking, but I'm serious. I mean, it is a true blessing to have a strong partner. And, some of you, I'm going to brag a tiny bit. Our daughter, we went to visit President Obama back in 2016. We'd been in the White House many times during his election. And we told her, Yolanda, you need to ask the president a question. We went in because Dad's bust is in the Oval Office, a bust of Dad, and it's been there since President Obama. It stayed there when President Trump was in. I don't know what's going to happen this time. He may put it out, but that doesn't matter. The energy is there. But my higher point is, so we were coming to see the bus because we'd been to the White House maybe 15 times during his time in office, but had not seen the bus. He said, Yolanda, would you come up with a question for the president? We didn't give her any more guidance. So her question to President Obama was, Mr. President, what are you going to do about the guns? Now, she was 7 years old at the time when we visited in 2016. 2017, I think, was when Parkland occurred in Florida. Parkland students, 16 students and a teacher were shot. 2018, she was invited to address the March for Our Lives. And she said, when we found out 2 hours before she was supposed to speak, we said, Yolanda, Andre said, do you need some help? Let me help you with your speech. She said, I already know what I'm going to say. Okay. By this time, she's almost 9. So she said, I'm Yolanda Renee King, the granddaughter of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. My grandfather had a dream that his 4 little children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream also. My dream is enough, and we must create a gun-free world. Bam, she drops the mic. She did drop it, but I feel she did. Now, here's my point. We're nowhere near that, but until something is deposited as an idea into the universe, it can't happen. We can get there. And that doesn't mean you can't hunt and do things that you need to do, but it's insane to need, to me, to have an assault weapon that shoots 1,000 bullets in 2 seconds. That's for wars. So why do we do that? If you hunt, it's not even fair to the animal. Really? But this is how enamored and how immersed we are in gun culture. Now, I know I'm in Virginia, gun state, just like Georgia, gun state. But I need us to think about how do we navigate. Our children go to school every day wondering whether or not somebody's going to come in there and shoot the school up. How crazy is that? There are other nations in the world that have guns, but why are they not reacting the way we are? There's something wrong that has to be interrupted, intercepted, and changed for the better. Now, look, we can do this. We have to believe it and then know it, and then it becomes reality. So my apology for going on and on. I'm just passionate about things, and I let the Spirit lead me whenever I go. Sometimes I go too long. But I want to learn to do like my grandfather. My grandfather, as a Christian minister, he'd preach a sermon about 15 minutes as he got older. Some preachers preach 2 hours as they got, some people talk for hours as they get older. I guess it's because they want to present longevity. But he used to say, I'm going to end because I don't want to run the risk of talking more and more and beginning to say less and less. 15 minutes, he was done. I went way over that tonight, but pray for me.
It was worth it.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Martin Luther King III. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Andrea Stevens King. Waters King, I'm so sorry.
Terrific.
Andrea Waters King, thank you so much for your remarks. Thank you, Larry Sabato, and thank you all for your great questions.
Thank you all so
Wonderful
much.
event.